On this episode of Doing the Most, we're making Jack Keller's recipe for plum wine.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Jack Keller was the GOAT, the OG home winemaking content creator on the internet. So big thanks to Jack Keller. His legacy leaves a lot for all of us to aspire to, and we're so thankful for the work that he put into home winemaking. These recipes in this series come from his book, and there will be a link in the description to where you can pick that book up. Proceeds from the sale of the book still support Jack's family. Also, big thanks goes to Homebrew Ohio for sponsoring this series. They provided some of the gear and equipment to make this Jack Keller wine series possible. There's a whole playlist developing of all of these videos. We're trying to do one a month for an entire year. So thank you, Homebrew Ohio, for your support. Now, the usual Jack Keller rules about headspace apply here. All the recipes in Jack's book end up being less than 1 gallon when you get to secondary. So either have a smaller vessel prepared for secondary or be prepared to clear it and bottle it fairly quickly so you don't experience headspace issues like oxidization or maybe an infection. If you don't have a smaller vessel or you can't bottle quickly, just scale the recipe up by 25 or 30%, so that way when you get to your secondary vessel, if it's a 1 gallon vessel like this, you'll fill it all the way up rather than having a bunch of headspace here. We're kind of trying to go by the book with Jack's recipes here, so you'll see at the end of this process part of our video that there'll be a considerable amount of headspace in there, and we take care of that by doing a quick cold crash and just getting it into bottles. So when I made this wine, plums were really hard to find. This was back in December, January of this year. Right now, plums seem to be in season because they're everywhere, and I actually have a bucket of sand plum mead going right here with freshly foraged sand plums. So right now may be a good time to hit up your grocery store, hit up your local international market or Asian market for a variety of different kinds of plums and make some plum wine. So, all that context out of the way, let's take a look at our ingredients. The ingredients for Jack Keller's plum wine are 6 pounds of plums, 1 can of 100% white grape juice frozen concentrate, 1 pound, 10 ounces of granulated sugar, and water to 1 gallon. We'll also be using 1 teaspoon of powdered pectic enzyme, 1/8 teaspoon of grape tannin, 1 teaspoon of yeast nutrient, and 1 gram of Fermaid K. Our yeast for this wine will be Lalvin's DV10. So as you can see, it's a pretty simple ingredients list. It does include that DV10 yeast, which sometimes local homebrew shops may have to special order or may not have on hand. But other than that, everything there is relatively accessible and easy to find. So let's take a look at how this wine is made. The process of making Jack Keller's plum wine first starts with pitting and chopping all of those plums. In addition to plums being hard to find, grape juice concentrate was hard to find at the time I made this video, so I ended up having to make my own by buying white grape juice and slowly, delicately simmering it down to reduce it to about 20-25% of its original volume. That way I had a thick grape juice concentrate that I could work with and keep the same proportions as what Jack had in this recipe. Now, if you run into the same problem, rather than making your own grape juice concentrate, you could probably just substitute half of the water for white grape juice and get a similar result. But I wanted to show you Jack's recipe as it was in the book, and so I made my own concentrate. And if you are making your own concentrate, just be careful not to go too far and not to caramelize it. All you're trying to do is evaporate off some of that water content. So we start off by getting a quart of water heated up. And then we're going to place all of those chopped up plums into our cleaned and sanitized 2-gallon brewing bucket. Now, I say all of them. I know a couple pieces escaped to the floor, never to be seen again. Our yeast nutrient goes in. And our wine tannin goes in. And then our grape juice concentrate goes in. We brought that water to a boil and then just cut the heat, and it goes right onto those cold plums so you can see some of that steam coming out. This will help us get that sugar dissolved. Then our sugar goes in, and we'll get that stirred up and dissolved so nothing settles on the bottom. So stir, stir, stir. And once that's had time to come down to room temperature, we will add our pectic enzyme and we will pitch our yeast. We don't add the pectic enzyme when the must is hot because heat will denature pectic enzyme. So we want to make sure it's room temperature so we don't destroy the enzyme that is in there intended to break down our fruit and help it release its color and its flavor. Stir, stir, stir. That gets covered and it will go under an airlock to ferment. And every day to 2 days, we'll open that up and punch down the fruit cap just to keep damp any of the fruit that has risen to the top because we don't want it to dry out and potentially become a vector for mold or other microorganisms that we don't want in our wine. Once our hydrometer reaches 1.060, we're going to add our Fermade K. So it has some additional nutrient in there for a smooth finish to our fermentation.
There are two nutrients being used in this recipe. One is diammonium phosphate. It's kind of like candy for yeast, and we're putting that in at the beginning. And then the other one is Fermade K, which we're giving a little bit later on in the process. And Jack does that because inorganic nitrogen, like diammonium phosphate, becomes more difficult for the yeast to utilize once the alcohol by volume in your wine has grown higher than 9%. And Fermade K includes some inorganic nitrogen. So that's kind of balancing the nutrient load by using inorganic at the beginning and then some inorganic and some organic toward the middle of fermentation. There are a lot of different ways to nutrify your wine must, and you might want to choose to just front load it with all diammonium phosphate, or you might want to do only organic nutrient like Fermade O, and any of those will work. There are plenty of nutrient calculators online that will help you figure out just how much nutrient you need in your wine.
And now Jack recommends to remove the fruit after a few days. I went ahead and left it in because it was still relatively intact a week and a half later when fermentation finished. So when I racked mine to secondary, I just left the fruit behind in the bucket and then tossed it into the compost heap afterward. Since there was quite a bit of headspace on here, I put it in my wine fridge to cold crash so I could bottle it a few days later.
And now it's time for my favorite part of these videos, the tasting. And you know, plum wine is usually kind of like a dessert drink. It's usually fairly sweet. You'd have it at the end of a meal. And I'm doing all of Jack's recipes just bone dry, fermenting all the way out to 1.000 or lower. I think this one went to 0.998 if I recall. So just below the 1.0 line on the hydrometer. And so it's dry. And I didn't do any stabilizing or pasteurizing or back sweetening. I left it just as it is because I think it's a good baseline for understanding the flavor profile. And that way, as you get to know it, especially as it ages, you can kind of get to know what you might want to do as far as sweetening when you're making your second batch. So let's go. It has retained quite a bit of that kind of amber red color that we started out with, most of which was being pulled from the skins of those plums. And it's got a nice, brilliant clarity and a little bit of legginess. It doesn't cling to the glass too much. It smells weirdly kind of like fresh plums. It doesn't really smell fermented. You just pick up a little bit of that hint of alcohol on the nose, but at this juncture, it's about 9 months old, and it feels like the alcohol in the nose has aged out pretty well. Let's get in there. Ooh. Whoa. It is plum heavy. Ooh. There is still a little bit of heat in there, but what you get is that sense of puckering when you bite into a plum that's just shy of ripe. And so there's that tartness and that tannic character that kind of wick on your tongue a little bit. It's like biting into slightly underripe fruit. I can see how some sweetening would definitely help bring some of the plum character back in this, but it is very plum forward. I am a little bit surprised, actually. I mean, there is a high fruit load in here, so it tracks that there would be good fruit flavor in here, but the plum forwardness, it kind of reminds me of the raspberry Jack Keller wine that we did, of just being all of that character, that fruit character, just right smack down right in the middle of your palate. So right as you take in that sip, it's tannic, slightly bitter, very puckering, and it cuts straight down the middle of your tongue. And then as you swallow, just a slight perceived sweetness, just like a fresh fruit sweetness, washes across the sides of your tongue. And as you exhale, it feels like you just swallowed a big hunk of fresh plum. It's very fruity. It is incredibly dry, but it really carries the essence of that fruit forward really, really well. I have really been enjoying brewing with plums in the last year. We have a friend who's given us plums from her tree, and I've brewed a couple of things with it. Actually, this is one of the things. It's a mead that I need to get bottled. And plum is just, it carries its flavor so well on the other end of fermentation. And I think it's something that I want to play with quite a bit more in my homebrewing experiments. Now again, there are a ton of different kinds of plums. Asian markets and international markets are a great place to pick up a variety. I can see maybe wanting to pick up 3 or 4 different ones and taste them, and maybe taste them together on a fork and kind of get an idea of what blending might look like, and do maybe a variety of plums in one wine. This was a single variety of plum, but it just turned out so incredibly lovely. Like, I think this is something that is really approachable, especially for the beginner home brewer. If you like this content, there's where to find us on the web. And there's a Discord community. I would mostly suggest you join that, because that's where I hang out. There's a ton of other people hanging out there, and it's just a really great, welcoming, warm, and helpful community. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the YouTube channel, I will not hold that against you, but you should probably go down and click that subscribe button right now. Even, go over and click like on this video. And of course, ring that notification bell down there so you get updates on all the new Doing the Most content here on the channel. Until next time, happy brewing, happy winemaking, thanks Homebrew Ohio, and cheers.